Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us as always, this time in Davos. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
Since we did that segment on snow, I've always been thinking about ski resorts. Is there snow over there in Davos right now or not?
Yeah, a bunch fell in the last 48 hours. So it's treacherous as ever, and the world's CEOs and bright young crypto wannabes are sliding around as best they can, trying not to kill themselves. Everyone is wearing ridiculously combined combinations of suits and snow boots and God knows what else. It's quite the show.
I hope you got good boots yourself. We're going to talk about something tied to the news this week, and the data point there is 3, as in 3 years, which is the amount of time it's been since the COVID pandemic started, at least tracing back to when China realized it had a kind of big mess on its hands and announced it to the world. So yeah, 3 years in, and here we are, and China still has a kind of mess on its hands.
Newly released satellite images are painting a grim picture of China's ongoing battle against the spread of COVID.
So just how bad is the situation? Last week, Chinese health officials said that nearly 90% of people in one of the country's most populated provinces were infected with COVID.
The images reportedly show larger crowds gathering outside local crematoriums and funeral homes across the country.
So we wanted to kind of dig in and focus on China here and try to figure out, what the pandemic has meant for its economy, what it means for it now, because it's still an ongoing story. So, Adam, we've talked before about China's zero COVID policy, but I figured we could start maybe with a very basic question, which is, enough time has passed since now China's reversed that policy. So can we say that China's zero COVID policy was a mistake? Is that a safe thing to say now?
I think it's easy to conclude that, right? Because I think this sudden retreat from zero COVID in the last, it's really barely more than a month, is the most severe and the most shambolic turn in Chinese policy since the beginning of the reform period. It's really catastrophic from that point of view. But I think if you look back, that's really not a fair judgment, or rather it's just not a very precise judgment, because zero COVID was obviously the way to go early on. And with the first variants of the disease, they were not so infectious that shutdowns, lockdowns, social distancing, all of that didn't actually work. And the Chinese demonstrated that it could work. And the tragedy for them is that the rest of the world failed. And out of that then came the Omicron variant in the fall of 2021, out of South Africa and Botswana, where it was first identified. And that, I think, is really where they run into serious trouble, because that's just so infectious that it will overrun any potential, effort to contain it through social distancing and whatever. And I think that's really where you have to say the failure sets in, because at that point, the Chinese should clearly have pivoted towards recognizing that zero COVID through social distancing and social discipline was not going to work against Omicron, and they should at that point have doubled down on vaccination. And the disaster is that as recently as the spring of 2022, only 20% of over 80s had 2 jabs and a booster, which is what you need with the Chinese vaccines. The Chinese vaccines are not going to prevent you getting sick, but they will keep you out of hospital and will keep you alive if you've had 2 plus a booster, a recent one. And they just fail to provide that to the most vulnerable group. And even now, they're only up to 40% of over 80s. Only 40% of over 80s actually have anything remotely like full vaccination cover. And their ambitious target is to reach 90% by the end of January, which you would say is, well overdue. So that's, I think, where the real failure lies, in the just ridiculously slow moving response to what was a shift in the parameters of the entire equation, because Omicron you can't effectively fight with social distancing.
So now China is dealing with outbreaks across the country, and that is despite there not being lockdowns, there are economic repercussions to this kind of widespread outbreaks in the absence of full vaccination, as you point out. So, what is the outlook right now for the Chinese economy? I mean, will they be able to do stimulus? And yeah, just more broadly, we've been talking about China's broader economy struggles with its real estate sector. We talked about how it may even be collapsing. I mean, has that been stabilized in any sense?
Yeah, there's a really interesting political story here. And I think we're still trying to get the measure of the changes in personnel that are going on in Beijing right now. There's clearly a softening of the stance in foreign policy. And in economic policy, too, we may be saying something similar with Liu He, Xi's confidant hitherto, but who is also a very conservative force in economic policy, who pushed for the stabilization of the property market, for a crackdown on tech, giving way to Li Qiang, who may be more of an opportunistic, go-getting kind of advocate of more stimulus. And what we certainly are beginning to see is a softening of the so-called three red lines policy on the property sector. So these were the limits on leverage, financial leverage, that were introduced in 2020 in a rather aggressive effort to prick the property bubble. The idea being that unless Beijing did this, it would lose control of, the flywheel on the Chinese economy, and it would get caught into a kind of boom-bust cycle, which the regime would find difficult to control. So the effort to stabilize made sense, but it came at a terribly bad moment, because essentially it intersected with the collapse of the zero COVID policy and the escalation of tension with the United States. So it made for a very toxic combination. And I think we are seeing a distinct softening. Now, this isn't going to be enough, most likely, to save the most prominent victim of the crackdown, which is Evergrande, indebted to the tune of about $300 billion. Much of that, of course, owed to domestic creditors and to people who've advanced money to build houses, apartments, which aren't going to get finished now, will only get finished after the bankruptcy is worked through. But overall, there seems to be a distinct weakening of the tough line that the Xi administration had previously taken. And the upshot of all of this is that we expect a pretty serious rebound in growth. So, I mean, the Chinese official numbers are, attracting more and more skepticism, but I think most outside observers think the Chinese economy will grow by only somewhere between 2.7 and 3% in 2022, which is lamentably slow by Chinese standards. That's by far and away the worst performance since the reform period began. And what we're expecting in 2023 is a return to growth rates of between 4 and 5.5%. 5.5% significant, because that was the target that was officially announced for 2022, which is not going to be met. And there's a number of larger Chinese provinces which are projecting growth in the coming year of 5 to 6%. So that would be a pretty considerable recovery, and we should look out for the targets that are announced at the National People's Congress in March, one of the two famous twin meetings that take place after the Chinese New Year, and give a sense of direction to the regime.
So just so I understand that correctly, to the extent that there's going to be new stimulus, it takes the form of allowing this real estate sector to kind of reinflate, like sort of getting out of the way of this bubble that they were trying to prick beforehand.
I mean, it's not really where they want to go, because the aim of the game was to shift the balance of the Chinese economy away from its heavy dependence on credit stimulus and the real estate sector, which had come to account for about 25% of GDP and was vastly overgrown. But the problem is, the real estate sector collapsing in the way it has been, with the property sales going down by, really dramatic percentage points, prices falling. I mean, they can't really allow that to go on for much longer, because it acts as a really powerful drag on the economy. And if the aim of the game is to stabilize and stimulate, the temptation will be to use that same instrument, not just to stabilize, but to stimulate. The reason why they might be really pressed to do this is the youth unemployment rate, which is really alarmingly high, hovering around 20%. The entire cohorts of people leaving high school and college who have entered this labor market disrupted by the zero COVID policy and the consolidation policies pursued since 2020. And so I think there's a sense that they need to put the pedal to the metal. And if they do that, the easiest thing to do is to, revive this construction sector. It is not far from ideal, and in a sense perpetuates their problems and will probably cause at some point them to have to redress the balance again. The much more promising strategy would be to focus on trying to boost consumption and to do so by allowing wages to increase, by creating a more adequate welfare state. One of the great dramas that's playing out in China right now is who actually pays for COVID treatment, which is hotly contested by Chinese health insurers. So all of those kind of measures will be better for the standard of living and will create a more balanced pattern. But given the urgency of the situation, the likelihood is, as well, they'll reach for the quickest fix. And it has to be said that without a stabilization in the real estate sector, consumption isn't going to recover anyway because people have too much wealth at stake.
Yeah, and yet despite it all, you mentioned growth rates potentially of 5, 6, 7%, and it sounds like a pretty healthy kind of rebound from even this kind of the throes of the pandemic. So, yeah, what are the implications for the global economy? It sounds like good news for the West, maybe more to export, but yeah, what does that actually mean? And maybe particularly for Europe, what do you think?
I think so. I mean, it certainly adds further doubt, I think, to the forecasts of a global recession that many of us were worried about a few months ago. China comes back. It will ease bottlenecks in supply chains because zero COVID was creating a huge amount of uncertainty. The sector which will most directly benefit, and on a giant scale, is tourism, because what Chinese have not been able to do is travel, and since the 8th of January they have been able to. And they are by far and away the most important driver of global tourism. I mean, in 2019, 150 million travelers went abroad from China. They spent over $255 billion. That's twice the amount that American tourists spend, who are the second largest group of spenders in foreign tourism. A lot of that is to Asia. It doesn't come to the West. Not very much of it comes to the United States at all, but it does tend to go to Europe on a large scale. And in 2022, those figures were down 95%. So that's huge. I mean, we're talking $250 billion in spending by Chinese tourists was basically cut down to a few tens of billions. It was a trickle. And by the summer of this year, it could be back up to about 50% of its pre-crisis levels. So that will deliver a huge boost to the tourism sectors of places like Cambodia, for instance, or Laos, or Hong Kong, or indeed the obvious destinations in Europe and the luxury brands that do so much business there. We're also seeing the rebound effect in commodity markets. So both copper and steel are off their lows, which they hit in the summer of 2022 amidst the sort of fear, in the aftermath of the Shanghai lockdown. So major rebounds there. Iron ore is up 50% since the summer. A really dramatic rise. And that, I think, points to the ambiguity of this story, because as the Chinese economy rebounds, and especially if it rebounds hard in the heavy industrial sector, tourism is one thing, that's a net gain for Europe on a huge scale. But if the Chinese heavy industrial sector rebounds, then what this does is to surge energy demand. In 2021, it surged so rapidly that the Chinese energy system came pretty close to collapse. There were blackouts, they had to ration power. And when that happens, what the Chinese do is to go shopping for energy. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese appear in the gas market. They can't obviously get it through pipelines because there aren't any, not enough. The Russians are building them now, but it'll be too slow. So where do they go? They go into the famous LNG market, liquefied natural gas. And that's where the Europeans have been desperately buying their supplies. So if China re-enters the East Asian LNG market, that is extremely bad news for Europe, because it was the missing Chinese demand for LNG in 2022 that created more or less ton for ton the space for the Europeans to buy LNG and fill up their storage tanks.
Just very briefly on the tourism point, I feel like this is not sufficiently appreciated. I mean, the zero COVID policy essentially was de facto keeping Chinese people at home.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't officially forbidding people from leaving the country, but it was essentially preventing them from leaving because they couldn't get back in. Is that basically how that worked?
Yeah, exactly. And there were also restrictions on people leaving, so it was difficult for people to get passports and so on. But all of that's lifted now, so there's a huge boom going on in Southeast Asia and in Hong Kong.
We'll be right back with more about China and COVID. Okay, we're back with our discussion on China and COVID. Adam, looking back over these past 3 years, I'm curious how China's role in the global economy has changed, if at all. I mean, as a result of this pandemic and its original kind of zero COVID policy response to it. I mean, you mentioned the kind of problems that were introduced into supply chains, how that played a role in producing inflation. Is China overall a less trusted trading partner now? And if not that, at least a sort of considered a less predictable economic actor than it was before all of this? And maybe, I guess, also on the political side, is it seen as a less trusted political actor? You know, it's been accused of hoarding information at the outset of the pandemic. It seems to be sort of, not being straightforward about pandemic right now and how it's spreading across the country. So, yeah, how has overall its role in global politics and economics changed?
I don't think there's much doubt that it's been terrible for China's reputation abroad, which is, of course, a matter very much in the eyes of the beholders, notably in the bloc that you might think of as the bloc that's gathered around the United States. So this includes Australia, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and really starting from the sort of face mask diplomacy of 2020, China's stock has sunk very, very dramatically across global public opinion. But that segment of it, so if you ask in Latin America and Africa, it's a rather different story. But in all of those places, and they're very, very economically significant, it's also not just simply a matter of what you think of China, but what the American authorities think of China. And if the American authority is engaged in quite aggressive sanctioning actions against China, then, like it or not, you have a hard time thinking about making investments or engaging in contact with China. I mean, from my university, I get an email now periodically, quite regularly, listing essentially all of the major Chinese universities. And I'm required to notify the general counsel of the university if I engage in any kind of intellectual contact, let alone joint research with all of China's major universities. So this, of course, has a chilling effect, there's no doubt at all. And if you look at financial flows into China, so-called portfolio investment purchases of Chinese assets, they went negative for a time in the first quarter or so of 2022. So there was actually money coming out of China. But what's very interesting is if you contrast portfolio investment, so relatively easy come, easy go buying of financial assets, with foreign direct investment, so investment in factories on the ground in China, you get a very, very different picture. And that's essentially just a continuous increase from record to record. So 2021 was more than 2020, 2022 was more than 2021, and by large margins. And we're talking about, in the order of about $140 billion went into China in foreign direct investment just up to August 2022. And we see this, it's interesting, it's coming from lots of different directions, but Germany, which you and I obviously both of us have a great interest in, has been particularly notable in this respect. It's quite hard, in fact, to think of a single German industrial company which in the last 12 months has not made an announcement of further large-scale investment in China. It's quite counterintuitive given the mood in the United States on an issue like this. But BASF, Siemens, Bosch, all of the German car companies are doubling down on their already substantial investments in China. They regard themselves to be underweight China assets. So there's a real kind of counterflow here. And in certain key markets, and as China recovers from COVID, as one perhaps hopes it will do, this tension, I think, will get more and more pronounced because the politics are going in one way and the foreign direct investment is going in another direction.
To clarify, I mean, what would account for that difference between investing in financial assets or foreign direct investment? I mean, what's behind the kind of move away from those financial investments exactly? I mean, that's also private capital making those decisions, right?
But they're different things you can buy. So I mean, property developers, for instance, in China were major issuers of bonds, and those were the sorts of things that foreign investors would, believe it or not, actually pile into until very, very recently. Supposedly smart money in the West, big smart money in the West, was holding substantial chunks of Evergrande debt, and some of them are stuck holding it. I mean, we're talking very serious, heavy-hitting names, and they go into that because you want exposure to China. You're not too fussy about how you get that exposure, so you buy the bonds of the firms which issue enough bonds. And then when the story turns, that money is easy to leave as well. Whereas the logic of BASF putting money in is simply, well, where do we expect growth in the global chemicals industry and plastics industry? Well, it's not going to be in Europe, is it? So it's clearly going to be in China. If you're in the automotive business, and you're looking at the future of electric mobility and EVs, you have to be in China. It's absolutely the core of the future of that industry. That's where the things are sold. That's where you're competing head on with the major Chinese manufacturers. That's where the supply chain is, because the battery producers are all there. I mean, and it's true of not just German companies. GM, for instance, is up to its neck in the Chinese market as well. So that's the difference, I think. It's really quite two rather distinct logics.
Yeah, that there's a different expression of trust in those different kinds of investments. Finally, I guess to shift away from China for a moment, I wanted to ask about something that President Joe Biden said back in September 2022. He declared just outright that the pandemic was over. We're now, as I said, 3 years in. I don't know if there's anyone with that actual responsibility to declare the pandemic to be over, but Biden took it upon himself to say so. So curious what you think. Was he right?
I think clearly not. I mean, and it's not a matter of scoring cheap points. I think it's rather more because I think many of us feel it's over, right? And because we want it to be over and we want to get on with our lives. And in many respects, you could say that it is over as far as I think the vast majority of the population of the United States and Europe is concerned. We carry on as though it's not really an issue. And we make that mistake, right, of that initial move of saying, well, moving away from China. But I mean, if there's one thing this pandemic has taught us, you can't move away from China. If tens of millions of people are getting infected every single day with a disease in China, and furthermore, all travel restrictions have been lifted, it really, really matters. So it's I think this is for me another test case of our ability to in fact encompass the reality of the fact that we're all totally entangled with each other. And the Chinese have finally come to realize this by ending zero COVID, because in the face of Omicron they just couldn't make it work. And now, in a sense, what I wanted to do this segment in part was I just have a sense that folks in the West, in Europe, and the United States, at Davos right now, are not taking seriously enough this drama. I mean, I think the rate of infection in China in December was probably the most rapid spread of a disease ever in history, because you had 1.4 billion people densely packed, tightly linked together, essentially immuno-naive in the face of a disease, Omicron, which was really ready to go. And it just ripped through Chinese society. I mean, so the upside from their point of view is that it will indeed pass through in a matter of 2 to 3 months. But the risk of that, of course, is that it's spawned some sort of dangerous new variant. And that's not happened so far. And it's not necessarily the ideal incubator for that, because really what you want there is people who are struggling with partial immunity and so on. But in any case, it's not good news. And furthermore, we also know at the same time that a new variant of COVID incubated in the West, the so-called XBB.1.5, the Kraken variant, is spreading very, very rapidly in the West right now. I mean, the numbers are quite significant. As of January 10th, there were 67,000 new cases reported in the United States every day, with a test positivity rate of 15%. And we all know that if your tests are yielding a 15% positivity rate, it's basically out of control. And most of the testing is now being done privately and not being reported. So there are just short of 500 deaths per day in the United States as of January 10th. And the hospitalization rate has increased by 17% over the last 2 weeks. And that's in the face of this new variant. Now, the new variant is super infectious by all accounts and overwhelms any kind of immunity that we currently have, because it has mutated to such an extent. It may, in its symptoms, be more like a cold than flu. But what this is telling us is that this disease is not done with this yet and is continuing to mutate. And in the background, not to alarm people, but we are also facing the most serious global pandemic of avian flu that we have faced in a very long time. And if you remember back to the early 2000s, avian flu was the true horror scenario, because in the instances in which it has crossed to the human population, it's been extremely lethal. What we've never had is an avian flu which becomes transmissible between people. But the bird to human transmission was 60 to 70% lethal in Hong Kong when it happened. So, that was the nightmare of the early 2000s. That's when the whole sort of global pandemic fear got going. And we are right now in the middle of a pandemic which has spread both to the wild bird population and the domesticated, the giant, highly concentrated chicken farm populations. And millions of birds are being culled almost, weekly right now around the world as outbreaks spread. So this, if you ask me what my tail risks for 2023 is, it's still the pandemic. And is why I keep banging the drum for this concept of polycrisis as well, because, there are bits of this which are systemically interrelated, the financial system, the inflation, the Federal Reserve sticking interest rates up. And there are bits which are, sort of predictable long-term type risks for much of the world anyway, which is the climate crisis. And then there are these two outside risks, which are, Putin's aggression against Ukraine and this shooting war that we are dealing with in Europe. And on the other hand, the pandemic, which is, you see, even if we get lucky and 2023 yields nothing in terms of disaster, a rational, I think, preparation for the year ahead includes contingency planning for the eventuality of another really serious turn in this disease. And that state of mind, that consciousness, you can get away from it by forgetting. But if you do, you just expose yourself to the risk of being blindsided again. And I think that the very fact that we face that dilemma, to me, marks out the fact that at some deeper level, it can't really be over. And it probably is in some sense better that it isn't. It becomes more endemic, as the epidemiologists say, when it becomes something that we in future have to reckon with.
On the other hand, you can't blame Biden for not, I guess, evoking the poly crisis, right?
Come down. Why make that declaration? It's unnecessary. It's not. No, there's no epidemiologist in the world who will agree with you. He was honest enough to go on to say we're still working at it, and he was paying homage to the healthcare workers who have been struggling with this and for whom, of course, the pandemic has never ended. And you can see why a president might want, to claim credit ahead of the midterms and everything else, but it's also giving hostages to fortune. So it's taking a considerable risk, I think.
Well, I know you didn't want to alarm people, but you may have, nevertheless, a little bit there by pointing out the new variants that are completely evading all of our existing immunity. But we will leave the conversation there for now. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.